looking at the facts, and I think that we need to get these facts straight. In the 2020 election, more than 160 million Americans voted, more than ever before. And in fact, the Trump administration's Homeland Security official charged with protecting elections deemed the election the most secure election in American history. Is that correct, Ms. Abrams?
That is correct.
And former Attorney General Barr stated that there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could have changed the outcome of the 2020 election. Is that right?
That is also correct.
So my problem is this. Why do you think 361 bills have been introduced in 47 states that would restrict access to the polls when, in fact, the way things were running was working for the people of this country? They were voting by mail like never before. They were exercising their way to vote, their right to vote, and they did it safely. Why did this happen?
With all due respect to Secretary of State Gardner, I would actually refer us back to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's commentary, and that is this. We saw an increased participation from communities that are considered unfortunate or that are not favorable to Republican victories. No one is entitled to win. I am a person who is a living example. There is no entitlement to victory, but we are all entitled to participation. And what these laws have done in stunning and uniform fashion is reduce entitlement to participation. They've done so by targeting behaviors that are specifically attributable to communities that voted in opposition of Republican values. Now, that is not to say that every person of color intends to vote Democratic. It's not to say that every young person votes Democratic. But when the overwhelming majority in those communities exercise their right to vote in this last election, we have seen a raft of laws that have been targeted at their behaviors. And when laws are targeted at the behaviors of communities of color, that is not only reminiscent of the Mississippi Plan and the Jim Crow laws, as Dr. Anderson has so clearly played out, those are intentionally a resurgence of voter suppression similar to Jim Crow, which is why we use that language, yes, because we cannot leave our history behind.
Thank you. And as Reverend Warnock said earlier, maybe it just boils down to some words, and that is that some people don't want some people to vote. Ms. Eiffel, can you tell me about how rare voter fraud is? I think there was a recent editorial in a major newspaper talking about since 2000, Oregon has sent out more than 100 million mail-in ballots and documented only about a dozen cases of fraud, rounded to the seventh decimal point. That's 0.0000001% of all ballots. Ms. Eiffel?
That is correct, Senator Klobuchar. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than finding widespread voter fraud. And in fact, President Carter spoke out about the report that was referenced earlier. He believes that the report was being distorted to support the provisions of SB 202. In fact, what the report called for was a deeper study of vote by mail. They were basing their study on 2005 to 2008. And the report specifically noted that we have two states, Oregon and Washington State, that do all voting by mail, and there is no significant voter fraud in those two states. And so voter ID, for absentee voting, that's actually quite unusual. There are only three, I guess now with Georgia, 4 states that require photo ID for absentee voting. And that's what we're talking about with SB 202. It's actually a rare and unusual thing.
Thank you. And we are going to be marking up the SF, Senate File 1, in the Rules Committee, and so I'm pretty familiar with this bill. And could you explain, Ms. Eiffel, why, yes, it has some very important standards for voting, given what we're seeing, the assault on voting across the country, but why, given that we have not had any federal campaign legislation passed since McCain-Feingold, which was basically dismantled by the courts, it is time to also focus on all of the dark money flooding into our politics, as well as ethics rules that are necessary for all of us. And that used to be a bipartisan issue.
Well, I think, Senator Klobuchar, it's important to see this all of a piece. This is about access to the political process. This is about ordinary people having access to the political process. We think of the right to vote as sacred, the casting of the ballot, the counting of that ballot. But if there are forces that neutralize the ability of that ballot to have meaning, then Congress needs to examine that also, so that citizens can feel that they truly have a role in our democracy and have their voice heard. It can't be a sham, it can't be a shell When activists marched and risked their lives for the right to vote during the civil rights movement, they weren't just looking at the ceremonial act of casting a ballot. They truly believed that being able to participate equally in the political process would allow them to meaningfully change the condition of their lives and communities. And so everything that bears on the ability to give that vote meaning, it seems to me, is relevant and important for this committee to consider.
Thank you. And with your indulgence, just one very fast question with a fast answer, Ms. Abrams. One of the things as I prepare for this hearing that I'm chairing next month, one of the arguments made is that, oh, it'll be so hard for states to enact these. However, we already have 43 states with early voting, 21 states with same-day registration, 19 states with automatic voter registration, 45 states that allowed all voters to cast a ballot by mail last year. In 2018, Michigan approved many changes to its election procedures that went into effect before the November 2020 election. Would you agree that states like Georgia and others have been able to implement these changes in a correct way without a problem?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Senator Cornyn. My first.
They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, as we await a very important moment for justice in my state today, our work goes on. And I am here today, first of all, to acknowledge the loss of my mentor, Vice President Walter Mondale. He caught the nation's attention fighting for justice, so it is such a moment. Working in the forefront of the right to counsel in the landmark case Gideon v. Wainwright. He followed in the footsteps of Hubert Humphrey to arrive in the Senate. He did great things passing civil rights legislation. As Vice President, he defined the office of the modern-day Vice President. He was Fritz to us. He was our Attorney General, our Senator, and our Vice President. And I know he's up there right now, rooting for justice. I'm going to speak more about Walter Mondale next week, and Senator Smith and Senator Grassley and I have a resolution honoring him for his time in the Senate, for his time as Vice President, which we will be presenting next week. But now, in the name of justice and the idea that justice must keep rolling along, I want to talk a little bit about some of the people we need in place as we look to the future. As we look to the future of police reform and the work that you have done as the lead on this bill, Mr. President, and the work we must do. To do that, we need a functioning Justice Department. We have an Attorney General who's excellent in Merrick Garland. We congratulate Lisa Monaco, who is expected to be confirmed later today with a strong bipartisan vote. But we need more, and we need the presence of true leaders in the Justice Department. We need to see Kristen Clark and Vanita Gupta confirmed. Walter Mondale was someone who always raised the bar. He was someone who was ahead of his time. When he introduced housing legislation and child care legislation, a lot of people said, oh, why are you doing that right now? I think that's a little bit the experience of these two women. Ahead of their time, doing the right thing. Speaking of raising the bar, you know that when many of the women of the Senate come to the floor, it's something important is going on. And given the challenges that our country faces today, the stakes are high. So today we make the case for Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, and to address the unfair and unsubstantiated attacks that we have heard from the other side of the aisle against these eminently qualified women. I have worked closely with Ms. Gupta and Ms. Clark for many years, and I'm confident they will lead the Department of Justice with honor and integrity. Their nominations also represent a historic opportunity to make progress toward the goal of ensuring that our government looks more like the people it represents, especially at the Department of Justice. When we confirm Ms. Gupta, she will be the first civil rights lawyer and the first woman of color to serve as the Associate Attorney General. And when we confirm Ms. Clark, she will be the first Senate-confirmed leader of the Civil Rights Division to be a woman of color. And they will bring years of experience to bear to take on the challenges we have right now, like hate crimes, which we are taking action on this week in the Senate, like voting rights, where we just had a hearing today in the Judiciary Committee, and where in just a few weeks we'll be marking up the For the People Act in the Rules Committee, which I chair. And as my state and my country are reeling after the killing of Daunte Wright, and as we await the verdict in the murder of George Floyd, we need Ms. Gupta and Ms. Clark at the Department of Justice to take on systemic police and criminal justice reform. They are also the leaders Attorney General Garden wants at the department, which I asked him about at his nomination hearing. He said Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, quote, have skills that I do not have. They have experiences that I do not have. And he said, no human being can have all of the skills necessary to run the Justice Department, and I need this leadership team if I am going to be successful. Attorney General Garland, who was confirmed by a bipartisan vote of 76 to 23, needs his team to be successful. That is something all of us should want. After what we saw during the previous administration, it is essential that the leaders of the Justice Department are committed to its independence in order to restore trust in our justice system. This is a priority for the Attorney General, and it is a priority for Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark. Vanita Gupta has demonstrated her commitment to the pursuit of justice her entire career. As an attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, she worked on the front lines, fighting in court to protect the civil rights of some of the most vulnerable people. Later, at the American Civil Liberties Union, she brought cases on behalf of immigrant children and worked to end mass incarceration while keeping communities safe. While serving as our country's chief civil rights prosecutor at the Department of Justice during the Obama administration, Ms. Gupta led critical work on criminal justice reform, prosecuting hate crimes and human trafficking, defending the right to vote, and protecting the rights of the LGBTQ community and those with disabilities. And as president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest, largest, and most diverse civil and human rights coalition, Ms. Gupta has a record of fighting for all Americans with dedication and a willingness to work across ideological lines to achieve results. Ms. Gupta's depth of experience at the Department of Justice and her years as a civil rights attorney makes her eminently qualified to serve as Associate Attorney General. And I've seen, as I know you have, Mr. President, her work firsthand. I was one of the co-sponsors of the First Step Act, which made much needed reforms, a bill that you put so much leadership on. And Ms. Gupta worked with us as she brought a broad range of organizations and experts in support of the bill, including both law enforcement and civil liberties group. Grover Norquist, a Republican and president of Americans for Tax Reform who supported the First Step Act, described Ms. Gupta as an honest broker, someone with an ability not only to understand but also appreciate different perspectives. She was someone who sought consensus. As I look what my state has been through for the last year, and as we await this verdict at this moment, that is exactly the kind of person we need at the department right now. And if you have any lingering questions, I say to my colleagues, just take a look at the number of law enforcement groups that have come out in support of her nomination. Just look at it. She is the right person for the job at the right time. Then there is Kristen Clark, nominated to be Assistant Attorney General to lead the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Ms. Clark has spent her entire 20-year career fighting for civil rights and equal justice under the law. Early in her career, she worked as an attorney in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department in the Bush administration. She investigated and prosecuted hate crimes, human trafficking. She also worked in the division's voting section. Since 2016, she has been the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil and Human Rights, one of the country's largest and most important civil rights organizations dedicated to the pursuit of equal justice for all. And it is important to note the history of the Lawyers Committee, which was created at the request of President John F. Kennedy in the summer of 1963, perhaps the defining year of the civil rights movement. This is an organization of attorneys founded to organize their peers to use their training to advance civil rights for all Americans. Isn't that just who we want leading the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice? I've worked with Ms. Clark many years on election issues. She testified before the Rules Committee, impressed everyone on both sides of the aisle. At that time, she said that following the direction of many, she is going to work to ensure that the Civil Rights Division is using the tools in its arsenal. And she said that now as she's been nominated for this position. The Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Absentee Citizens Voting Act, to ensure that eligible Americans have access to the ballot in our country. She also mentioned that she was here in the Senate chamber in 2006 when this body passed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act on what vote? 98-0. That is why she has support from Republicans and Democrats who work on these issues. Trevor Potter, who previously chaired the FEC as a Republican commissioner, called Ms. Clark one of the foremost legal experts in the country on voting rights and described her as smart, honest, and deeply committed to equal justice under law. Trey Grayson, former Secretary of State from Kentucky, who is a Republican and served as the chair of the Republican Association of Secretaries of State, sent a letter expressing his strong support of Ms. Clark. And we've also heard from former Assistant Attorneys General of the Civil Rights Division, who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, who wrote, "We find Ms. Clark to be an excellent candidate from the standpoint of experience, temperament, and commitment to the rule of law. She has the experience, the commitment, and the passion to do this job." I am joined by a number of our colleagues today. Senator Stabenow was here earlier. Senator Rono is with us on the floor to stand up for Ms. Gupta and Ms. Clark and to reject the falsehoods we've heard from our colleagues on the other side. But we are also here to make the case for why we must seize this historic opportunity to send 2 women of color to lead the Justice Department. So as this pivotal moment we live in, at this very moment, to my message to my friends Vanita and Kristen today is this: we have your backs, just as you have the backs of the people of this country. Those jurors in Minnesota, they're not talking to each other about if they're Democrats or Republicans. They have a job to do. The witnesses that came forward in that case, people who just happened to be there, a store clerk doing his job, a man that just happened to walk by, the police officers who testified, they didn't ask people what political party they were in. They just came forward. That is why I ask my colleagues to step back and think about what justice really means today and what it will mean tomorrow, and ask them to support Ms. Gupta and Ms. Clark to serve with Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco to run the Department of Justice. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton,
Mr. Hoeven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Thanks. Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.